So good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Anna Rea. I'm a senior researcher here at Ulm University. And I will be the moderator of this round table. Many thanks to Professor Jaffe for being here today. It is really an honor to have you here to share some of your precious time with us. And thanks also to the other participants to the round table of today. I will give the floor to all of them in a few minutes. I would also like to thank the American Consulate in Milan in the person of Dr. Simonetta Romagnolo, Director of the Public Affairs Section here in Milan. Consul Tony Deaton was unlikely unable to participate today, but I'm really happy that we have Simonetta today with us. I also would like to thank the Humanities Department of Ulm University in the person of the director, Professor Giovanna Rocca, for having allowed us to organize this event today. We are all women. It happened. We didn't do it on purpose, but it happened, and I would say I'm very happy about that. So before we start, I would like to give the floor to Simonetta Romagnolo for a greeting. Let me add that Simonetta graduated from Ulm University in foreign languages and literatures, so it's a really great pleasure to have you today.
Thank you, Anna. I'm very, very happy to be here today. It was quite a challenge to get to Ulm this morning, but we made it and we are very, very happy. So I'm Simonetta Romagnolo and I'm in charge of cultural affairs and exchanges at the American Consulate General in Milan. My director, Anthony Deaton, the public diplomacy officer and consul for press and culture, could not make it here today because after 3 years of avoiding COVID, he finally got it today. And so he's still in quarantine and he's very sorry not to be here today. Thank you to all the organizers. Thank you to Anna, my dear friend, for putting together this panel today. The U.S. Consulate General in Milan believes that cultural, educational, and professional exchanges between the U.S. and Italian academics is critical to strengthening broader U.S.-Italy cooperation and mutual understanding. So we support the travel of U.S. experts and academics to engage with university students and faculty in the free exchange of ideas and to build transatlantic professional networks. Professor Amy Jaffe is in Italy for about 10 days. He's here in Milan today. She will travel to Catania and Rome and Naples for the next days to engage with other Italian universities. And I myself will be in Turin tomorrow for another conference in American Studies. So we try to keep these exchanges alive and very active. Today's topic on women and sustainability is deeply relevant to our work and to the values that Italy and the United States share. We are very, very delighted to have brought Professor Amy Myers Jaffe of Columbia University to Italy for a round of lectures because we believe that she offers an important perspective on the role of women in promoting sustainability. So I personally look forward to hearing her perspective and those of all the participants here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simonetta. Thank you very much for your presentation. So before we start, I would like to introduce, of course, Professor Jaffe and the other participants to this round table. So let me introduce briefly Professor Jaffe. So Amy Jaffe is a leading expert on global energy and sustainability and author of several books, including her most recent, Energy's Digital Future, published in 2021 by Columbia University Press. A frequent media commentator, Ms. Jaffe has taught energy, business, and sustainability courses at Rice University, University of California, Davis, Tufts University, Yale University, and New York University. She is currently a research professor and director of the Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab at New York University's School of Professional Studies, and chair of the Women in Energy Initiative at Columbia University. From 2014 to 2017, Ms. Jaffe served as Senior Advisor on Sustainability to the Office of the Chief Investment Officer of the University of California Regents, where she helped design the Sustainable Investment Framework for the UC's $140 billion in pension and endowment funds. Ms. Jaffe was a member of the World Economic Forum's Council on Net Zero Transition and holds a Senior Fellow Career Prize from the U.S. Association of Energy Economics. So a very full career with many things. Let me also now give the floor to the other participants of this round table for a short presentation. So maybe Juliana, could you start introducing yourself?
I'm professor of English, Linguistics, and Translation in this university, and I teach in the degree program in Translation and Conference Interpreting. So I'm a linguist and a translatologist, so that is the area of my research, and I worked a lot on business communication and sustainability.
Okay. Vanessa, Emma?
Thank you. I am Emma Zavarrone, and I am a statistician. I am an associate professor in applied statistics, and I teach in communication teams, in communication course. And my field of study are textual analytics with focus on sustainability on SSR.
Okay. Thank you. Stefania?
Yes, so I'm Stefania Romenti. I'm professor of strategic communication at WIS University and delegate of director in sustainability for the sustainability of WIS University. So I work on sustainability from a practical point of view because I'm trying to transform this university in a more sustainable university. But in the meantime, I work on sustainability also from the research side, because as you know, for strategic communication, sustainability is a very hot topic, because if you don't communicate, you can be accused to hide something, so it's very risky. And if you communicate too much, you can be accused of greenwashing. So it's a very delicate, topic. So thank you so much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I look forward to participating to this debate. Thank you.
Vanessa?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Vanessa Gemmo. I'm an associate professor of Organization Science and Information System here in the Faculty of Communication. I'm delegate for director for Equal Opportunities. So this role underlines the investment, the effort of our university on these topics such as gender equality, inclusion, diversity and inclusion, And I am also the president of the Committee for Equal Opportunity here in the university. The role of this committee is to guarantee equal opportunities within our university, but also to promote these topics in the audience, in the public audience. And also for me, it's a pleasure to be here with you, to be able to have this debate all around these topics that are so important. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, so thank you to all of you. Now I would give the floor to Professor Jaffe for her presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here and also to learn what you're doing in strategic communications and in sustainability. So I look forward to our discussion, so I'll try to keep my remarks limited so that we can have more interchange. But, you know, in thinking about the role of women in sustainability, I think it's important and also statistically significant because according to the United Nations, about 80% of people who have been and will be displaced by climate change are women and girls. And so I think that advocacy for climate action and for sustainable action comes naturally to women politicians, to women activists, because women are so directly affected. And there's been some very good academic studies on why it is that women are more vulnerable to climate change. And it's specifically not because, you know, women aren't strong enough to, you know, avoid a flood or something having to do with some kind of physical limitation. Most of it is socio-cultural. So take a place like Bangladesh, where it's not proper or appropriate for women to attend public meetings. So then when the government or local government or federal government has briefings for communities about evacuation, about safety, about how to handle an upcoming disaster event, women are excluded from that activity and do not hear that information directly because they're discouraged from coming out to public meetings. And because, again, they're not encouraged to come to public meetings, not only do they not have the necessary information for, you know, emergency preparedness, but they tend to not be first in line for medical and food assistance in the aftermath of a disaster. And you see that similarly in a different way in Africa, because a lot of women's livelihood is tied to their home and for working just in subsistence activities. So their survival is tied much more tightly to water resources, going and collecting and bringing back water, and going and collecting and bringing back wood or other kinds of biomass. And so since that's the work they're doing in their community, they're less mobile, so they're less apt to be able to go to a different place and thereby have a job. And so if people in the community need to move, women are less able to move than men in the same community because they don't have economic mobility. They don't have skills that would allow them to move. And so they're not only less able to move away from the disaster, but if they did move away from the disaster, they're more apt to wind up, you know, in a camp where they're dependent on assistance. And then, of course, there are a high predominance of women who are engaged in subsistence activity and have no access to energy, so are suffering from energy poverty. So one of the things that's happened is that in the activism community, more women are attracted to working on these intractable issues for women around the globe. And therefore, as they become more and more engaged in these issues, they then rise to a higher level of activism on climate change. And you see a rising level of women who are in leadership positions in environmental activities. So, and the studies that have been done show that, especially here in Europe, in parliaments, the more women in political leadership, the more stringent climate policies and environmental policies get passed. And also, which is important for climate change, the more women have political representation in government, the more there's a correlation to higher spending on foreign assistance, especially causes that affect women directly. If you think about in our country, in the United States, the emphasis that Hillary Clinton gave to that, those kinds of activities when she was Secretary of State. And so when you think about climate change, you know, having put that in a context, and you think about the deficit we have in global climate finance to help countries with adaptation and resilience from disasters. It's very important, women play a very important role in government in making sure that appropriate amount of money gets allocated towards foreign assistance, because of course foreign assistance can be rather unpopular at times when it's economic hardship. So, so that kind of gives you a little bit of a perspective on how women came to be leading. And the UN has taken an effort to try to get more women to be involved in the Conference of the Parties for the official global climate negotiations. The statistics for women as head of delegations, head of the climate delegation, is not so great, maybe 20 to 30%, and not actually been on a steady rise. It's been very volatile. In the bodies that, what they call the constituent bodies, so that would be the bodies that do the actual detailed work, specialization topics, there it's closer, and some of them it is equal, 50% women and 50% men. But if you think about many of the big achievements that we've had in climate change, some of it began with Angela Merkel when she was just the Minister of Environment in Germany, and she was one of the first people to get the idea of a scientific target for emissions to be passed. And of course, Laurent Toussiani was a lead negotiator for France in the achievement of the Paris Accord, and we all have heard of Christian Figueira playing a very prominent role. So we've had these very visible women, and I do believe that that's helpful in mobilizing other women in different countries to feel that it's possible to be influential and to, you know, strive to participate in a more active way. And last point on that is that one of the things the UN is starting to do that's very important is they're starting to give training to women from the global south to learn how to be a climate negotiator. Because if you think about the idea that 80% of the people who are going to be victims of climate catastrophe, and you think about the importance of having voices from countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America be able to work on topics like the Loss and Damage Fund and other kinds of just solutions to global climate change on a global level. It's very important that women in the countries that are going to be most affected are able not only to have a leadership role, but to be trained to be effective in negotiation and diplomacy. and interpretation and other important fields. So I think it's an appropriate subject for us to talk about today when we think about what do we do in university settings to help students from other countries and our own students to help facilitate this enhanced role for women in diplomacy when it comes to climate change and humanitarian aid.
Okay. So thank you for this nice introduction. Well, you were actually focusing on many important topics related to women and sustainability. So before giving the floor to the other participant to the this roundtable, I would like to mention something that is related to my education. So this event was supported by the Humanities Department here at Ulm University, and I'm a humanities person. I would like to refer to an American nature writer that had the chance to meet when I was studying in the U.S. She is Terry Tempest Williams. I don't know if you ever heard about her. She's a writer, a nature writer, and in particular, in a book that I'm going to mention, which is Refuge, she discusses about the above-ground atomic testing in Nevada during the Cold War, and how this affected the health of a neighboring population with radioactive fallout. Williams especially talks about women in her family. She was living in Utah, so the neighboring state, and many women in her family were affected, had breast cancer because of the fallout. And so this is something extremely important to remember. I would like to actually mention only a few lines from her book, and then I'm going to ask you something about this. So in this last part of her book, she speaks about the moment she realized that she had the chance to experience personally a testing, an above-ground testing. And she is speaking with her father, and she writes, "So over the dessert, I shared a recurring dream of mine. I told my father that for years, as long as I could remember, I saw this flash of light in the night in the desert, that this image had so permeated my being that I could not venture south without seeing it again on the horizon, illuminating buttes and mesas. You did see it," he said. "So what? The bomb, the cloud." It was at this moment that I realized the deceit I had been living under. Children growing up in the American Southwest, drinking contaminated milk from contaminated cows, even from the contaminated breasts of their mothers. My mother, members years later of the clan of the one-breasted women. It is a well-known story in the desert West, the day we bombed Utah, or more accurately, the years we bombed Utah. Above ground atomic testing in Nevada took place from January 27, 1951 through July 11, 1962. Not only were the winds blowing north, covering low-use segments of the population with fallout and living ship dead in their tracks, but the climate was right. So, and let me just add another short quotation. So, when the Atomic Energy Commission described the country north of the Nevada test site as virtually inhabited desert terrain, my family and the birds at the Great Salt Lake were some of the virtual uninhabitants. So this was just to introduce the topic of nuclear energy and nuclear power. So in Europe, we are experiencing, after decades, fear because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. So we have fear of an atomic war. And also, another topic related to this is what is happening in the European community. So the European community is considering the possibility to consider the atomic energy a green energy. And I know that UK is doing this already. So what do you think about this use of nuclear power as a green energy, and also about what is happening with the nuclear power nowadays?
Okay, well, that's quite a topic.
Yeah.
Wonderful passage. And I think the passage reflects the fact that our sensibility about what is acceptable is radically changing. And there might have been a time when someone, even myself, would be asked a similar question, and one would be, the forum would be on energy security, and the question would be narrowly focused on the question of economic achievement. So are we going to have a recession, or do we need to keep economic growth moving? And every answer would be in the context of economic growth, right? And I think when we think about sustainability, and when we think about our path forward and how we're going to use energy, we need to decouple it from this idea that we have to have more and more wealth and more things, right? Because we have to live in a different way. And we haven't quite grabbed that yet mentally, that we're going to have to live in a different way, right? And so you have an entire generation, I would want to feel like saying men, but maybe it was broader than that, that thought of things in a particular way, and we need to move away from that thinking, and I do think the younger generation is moving away from that thinking. And therefore, when we analyze the question about nuclear power, we need to put it into that broad context. So one of the interesting things that happened this winter, and I'm sorry that I did not memorize the statistics, though maybe while somebody else is speaking, I'll Google for them. But we've just had the final statistics for what happened in 2022 and why Europe did not experience the blackouts and other kinds of shortfalls that were expected. And, you know, a lot of that was luck of the weather. All good. But a lot of that actually were permanent changes. I think something like 30% of the replacement of Russian natural gas came because countries accelerated installation of solar and other kinds of renewable energy, and that's permanent. But part of it came from people using less. And we don't, you know, in fact, I was just on the radio in the United States and I made this point, and I'm wearing a sweater, so it's an even more important point to make. So when I was a young person, not to date myself, but Jimmy Carter was president when I was a little girl. And, you know, he came out on TV in the sweater and he made this pitch that everybody should put their thermostat down. And he was ridiculed for decades. And of course, this winter, politicians in Europe had to say that. And indeed, in the United States, in California, last September, there was a terrible heat wave, and because of climate change. And the state of California text messaged everyone in the state to tell them what time they had to turn their cooling system off, or not off, but to very high temperature, and when they could and couldn't charge their car and do other kinds of energy-intensive activity. But as I told people, someday they're not going to text you and ask you to do it. We're going to have this technology, which I write about in my book, where you're going to sign a piece of paper, like the way we all agree to Apple. We have no idea what we agreed to, right? You're going to sign something like that, and then your electric utility is literally going to be able to change your thermostat without your participation, just digitally. And those tools are going to be important, and they're going to mean that we're going to, over time, hopefully need less energy to do the same thing. And so I think we have to ask the question, we're constantly asking the question, what energy source do we want to use? And I'll talk in a minute specifically, sorry to be so long-winded, about the technicalities of nuclear. But that, in my opinion, right, takes us down the wrong roadway. Not to criticize you, I'm not criticizing you. Nuclear power is definitely a concern, especially with the facility in Ukraine that could cause an accident that would pollute all of Europe. Like, it's not a small issue. But in thinking about the future of what are we going to invest in, that choice needs to be highly informed by changing the way we live and the amount of energy it takes to live the way we live, right? And no one wants to discuss that because it's unpopular. But we need to be able to have an open discussion about that. And if a politician and a political leader or academic leader talks about that, we need to not heckle them, right? Now, on nuclear power, I think the scariest thing I've ever had to participate in is I was at the World Economic Forum, and there was a breakfast on nuclear power. And the people from the World Economic Forum asked me if I could attend, so I had to get up really early in the morning to go to this breakfast, and it was led by leaders from Norway and Denmark. And I thought, well, that's very strange that they're leading this thing on. So I thought it was going to be about nuclear proliferation because, Norway and Denmark take a long history of participating in peace talks. And I get to this forum, and it turns out that I am, without any briefing, representing the U.S. government because there's no one else there from the U.S. government. And the forum is a closed-door breakfast with 20 leaders from around the world. And the subject is the safety of nuclear plants from cyber attack. And I thought, it was after Fukushima accident, and I thought, this is terrible. And we had a very frank discussion about the risks because they're very high. Any plant that's an older plant that needs backup electricity can be hacked. right? So when we look to the future of nuclear power, the next generation of facilities don't use water for cooling. And so theoretically, they're safer, because a lot of what has happened in the past with accidents has come from the fact that somehow the cooling system is turned off and or interrupted, and then you have this, you know, meltdown catastrophe scenario. So I do have more confidence once it's tested and proven in these sort of small nuclear reactor, you know, SMR design, because it's, and some of these reactors that use liquid non-water coolants, because there's much less possibility of nefariousness, much less possibility of just an accident, and so forth. But I'm more concerned, frankly, because, you know, how many of those will be deployed, and it'll be over a long period of time, and we now are starting to understand how much we can do with solar using different technologies to balance it. I'm more concerned about the plants we already have, right? So you tell the story about the testing, but we literally are living in a frightening age where a single government could decide to make an accident at an existing plant. And it would have unbelievable consequences. And I don't know if you've watched that HBO miniseries called Chernobyl, right? But when you watch that very accurate depiction of what happened at that time, and you think about the consequences if the scientists had not stood up to the government officials in the USSR, I mean, the consequences for Europe would be just unthinkable. And so we do need to think about, and I do think that women play an incredibly important role, we need to demand that peaceful solutions and different kinds of leadership thinking about conflict. We have to change how we think about conflict. And the consequences are just so high that I hope this younger generation of women will do a better job than we did at our generation.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. And the problem is always how we can influence decisions. And I was thinking about the COPs that I know you participated in many COPs. So do you think that it is possible to do something there, to decide something? You know that we know that there are no mandatory decision taken there. So how can we influence decisions? So which are the places in which we can do something?
So let me break that into two parts. The first part is that, in my opinion, all the marching around enables the people who are inside that think differently and want to have solutions. It like empowers them to be more successful, right? So I do think that youth activism, while in some institutions, if we're here today, we had to take a whole circuitous way of getting here because of the protests. I think that without youth activism, we would not even have been to Paris, right? So wherever we've gotten, in my opinion, you know, it started with youth activism, and that's, you know, a very important element to it. But I know a lot of people write and talk about how, you know, with the war and other things, there's going to be no possibility of a climate agreement, and the United States and China, you know, need to de-escalate, but if they don't, that means we're going to block a climate agreement. And, you know, we have a lot of acrimony in the world about loss and damage because we have countries that have basically contributed nothing to the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And they are the ones who are most impacted by climate change. And yet no one is giving them the money they need to manage loss and damage. And let me say that loss and damage goes beyond just rebuilding physical infrastructure, that people make the point that when there's a community somewhere that where the whole culture revolved around fishing industry, and now there's no fishing industry in that place, it's the losses more than just how much money were they making from fishing. I mean, they're losing their whole way of life. That has its own intrinsic value, and therefore, when people talk about, you know, in like the United States, in fact, quite honestly, you know, set up this idea of a global insurance fund, and that's good for physical things, but, you know, what are we going to do about people having to move and people having heritage loss? And, you know, thinking about that in a bigger way, you understand that that can't be solved just through a global insurance mechanism. So in thinking about that problem, when I talk to people, what I actually see on the ground, working with governments, like I have students who come from Indonesia and from India and from South Africa and from Mexico, is that in those countries, there is transformational thinking. The thinking, you know, sometimes you see the publicity, no, we have to use coal because people are poor, or we have to use coal because we have to have reliable energy. But actually, those very governments are working on strongly moving towards energy transition. You know, India is talking with us in our research about how to impose carbon prices in India. Before, there'll probably be carbon market in India before there is one in the United States, for example. I mean, not counting California. So I actually feel a little bit more optimistic that the more we have experiences like the floods in Tanzania and the heat wave here and fires and the floods in Pakistan, that it becomes so impossible to say that we're not going to take climate action, that we'll have more climate action. And I don't even know if, I mean, when we have these international forums, it's all about what's fair, but really what we're trying to do is motivate ambition. And I feel that in that regard, we're not going as fast as we need to, but the trajectory is in the right direction.
So now I would give the floor to our roundtable participant, and I would start with Professor Garzone.
Thank you. So I would like to focus now on some of the areas where studies have shown that women's action has a particular impact on sustainability and activism. You mentioned women being more vulnerable and therefore this sort of leading to activism, and then you mentioned women's participation in politics, mentioning Merkel. I would like to focus attention to two different areas which are very different, but in both cases women seem to have especially positive action. One is with the promotion of sustainable development projects in local communities, above all in developing countries, where women actually seem to be especially active in this area, say with microfinance initiatives, and in this area they are they've been especially instrumental in promoting sustainable economic growth, especially locally. So this is one, area where women's action has had an especially positive impact, but also has somehow followed a path that has been very positive for the whole community. And then another area which is completely different, and it is within the corporate world. In the corporate world, again, there have been studies showing, there is one quite recent by McKinsey, I think, showing that women seem to be more sensitive to the impact of business activities on the environment. They tend to prioritize sustainability in choices and in the decision-making process, and they seem to be especially sensitive to environmental issues. So we have, these are two very different areas, but in both cases we have this proactive and positive action by women. And what do you think are the reasons for this? Actually, of course, there is a lot that has to do with socialization. Or another hypothesis is that actually these areas, the areas, say, of sustainability, for instance, in the corporate world, have had limited attention in time. So they are much less, let's say, colonized by men, by men's power. So women somehow, they find a space where they can, and this, of course, is very much in keeping with their sensitivity to environmental problems. So what is your view of these issues?
You know, I don't know. I mean, the polling is globally and also in the United States that women, for example, care more about climate change than men. I mean, that's just a factual polling statistic. I can't say why I think women would care more about environmental protection than men. You know, I would hope that maybe as we change culturally and more men are participating in family activity, they'll feel more connected in that way, and that would generate more concern about the natural world and health. But when you think about it, it doesn't actually make sense, right? It doesn't make sense that men would care. I mean, and I'm not saying it's as a bias. I mean, it's statistically shown that men are just less concerned. And it's hard to understand why that is. So I think maybe in the end, it's a communications issue, right? You know, we talk about, you know, everybody is somewhat in the field of communications, and it's, if women care more about it, so how do I communicate to the general population why this is important? How do I take on that responsibility and role, and then how would I do that to be effective so that we don't perpetuate that issue that it's women who are caring the most? I mean, everybody should care, right? And everyone's affected. So I don't really have a good answer. I just think that those people who can see what can happen and what we need to do to change need to be more visible, right? And the arguments they make and the information they share needs to be more compelling and less about what we're going to take away from people and more about what people are going to gain from taking climate action.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Professor Gemma?
Okay, thank you so much. So, my focus was on the role of women in promoting sustainability through all the dimensions of sustainability. So you mentioned some data and some examples at the very beginning of your speech, and so I would like to ask you something about the gender equality perspective through the all the 17 social development goals. So gender equality is an explicit goal of the 2030 agenda, but it is also a driver of sustainable development in all its dimensions. Women's empowerment is a key factor for achieving sustainable economic growth, social development, and also environmental sustainability. So these dimensions are analyzed in a UN Women report that describes all these 17 goals through the gender perspective. They write, gender inequalities remain pervasive in each and every dimension of sustainable development. Gender-based discrimination, deeply rooted and present across all countries, threatens to undermine the transformative potential of the 2030 agenda, referring both to environmental, social, and economic goals. At the very beginning, you mentioned some examples. In the last conference of the parties in Egypt, 2022, it was underlined how the disproportionate impact of climate change on women and girls is so evident. And it was described how 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. And the face of the climate refugee crisis is mainly female. These disruptions often land women in refugee camps where they face a greater risk of experiencing sexual and physical violence. And moreover, in many cases, the financial stress that climate change inflicts upon rural communities can force women into unwanted marriages for the sake of their own survival. Often, it can force them also to sacrifice their education too. So it is clear how the gender perspective can be used for analyzing the overall social and sustainable development. So my question is, according to your opinion, how much are the institutions, the states, and also the public audience aware of the importance of this gender perspective across all these 17 sustainable development goals? And how, also from a practical point of view, can gender equality make the difference for an overall sustainable development?
You know, maybe let me say that when you're looking at something from a global perspective, it seems very difficult to change things, right? You have to talk about economic factors, you have to talk about cultural factors. Of course, it was smartly mentioned the microcredit program, which has been, you know, very successful in different locations. But let me just share a personal experience. I've taught different courses over the years, and in my early years as a professor, I had a course at Rice University where we would study a problem of sustainable development in a particular location during the spring semester, and then we would go to that place in the summer and actually work on that problem with a group of combination of engineering students and humanities students. The humanities students would do surveys in a village, for example, and one year we went to Lesotho, which is sort of a country very contiguous with South Africa. And, you know, you're basically someplace where people have no services at all. There's no electricity, there's no water, and we would have people come, students come, and they would, with someone from our anthropology department who's a trained scholar, and the students had already been trained in this course to do a survey around a particular village to figure out what the needs are. And then we had a team of engineering students who would then, you know, have to work with us, the faculty, and we come up with a solution to that, some kind of solution that we could implement while we were there to the problem. And the physical solutions were, you know, not sophisticated because we're just a bunch of, you know, 10 or 15 people. They're not going to, you know, build something with construction, but we did some interesting things. We had methodology that we'd learned from the UN, how to, if you had a community where people were suffering with no food, not enough food, you know, you have this rainy season that washes the soil away, and you have the dry season where things die, and so there's a way of making these stone walls, and then inside it put kind of fresh soil, and then put actually garbage and metals and things and aloe plants in the soil so that it will remain fertile, and you've got the brick walls so it can't wash away. And we would go back multiple years and you would see that people had food, right? And just a simple solution. And we, you know, did a lot of things which you know, where you know, you put these rails on top of a building and you catch the rain during the monsoon season into barrels. And then you teach them how to keep the barrels such that they can use that water through the drought. And so we did a lot of things like that. One year we weatherized the whole school building so that it had natural light, using to cool the building in the summer and heat the building in the winter, using, you know, windows at different places. So we did different things. But one of the things I think the students learned the most was not, you know, doing those physical solutions and having to think through how to plan it and do it together as a team, which, you know, that's what I told the university they were going to learn. What we actually learned was that implementing those very easy engineering solutions, which we could do in, you know, a 6-week period, can be almost impossible because of the inequities that existed on the ground in those villages. And I mean, the one that I share with you, because it was so striking, is one year we were someplace and there were some women in the community whose husbands had gone to, you know, miles and miles away to work in factories, maybe in another country, and had used prostitutes, had gotten AIDS, and come back and given it to their wife. And then she was shunned in the village because she had AIDS and left to starve to death at the edge of this community with no food, no electricity, no water, no assistance of any kind. Just left, and if she had children, same with the children, just left at the edge of the village, basically to die, right? And, you know, when you come into these situations, I mean, it's very hard. I mean, it's hard and bad being an American because, you know, you have American sensibilities and you know, you are too arrogant and you want to impose your own way of thinking on everyone. And it's like a cultural problem, I think, for Americans, right? But on the other hand, you're there and we only have limited time. And you're like, you know what, we're going to build the garden for these people who are shunned off the edge of the village because we're Americans and we can. What are they going to say? No, you can't build a village for this person because they're shunned, right? So it was a very hard conflict because you can do more good if you can, and you can't do anything unless the chief of the village approves you to do it. And obviously you want to do, you know, what you think is the best thing, but then you have to get them to approve what you're doing. And they've already made this decision that these people should be left to die, right? And so I just share that story because the problem is not always that I don't have a physical solution. And it's not always that I don't have enough money to pay for something, because we had money from industry, from corporate donors, to go to these places and spend what we had to spend to help people so the students would learn about how to do that, and they would be able to bring that to their careers, right? But the problems that we faced on the ground were like human relations problems. Some of them were cultural, some of them were just, you know, poor leadership. Just you have a person who wound up being the son of the chief, and he became the chief, and he's not fit to be the chief. He's just not he takes all the resources for himself because he can, right? So that to me was really the biggest challenge, right? And also the challenge of having to work in environments like that where there's a lot of violence, because we went to places where we've gone to some places where we had to worry about, you know, we're Americans and somebody's intoxicated and they're going to make a riot in a culture where it'd be bad for us, you know, and we managed it well because we're good at that, but, you know, could have been gone the other way. So those problems I just share because, you know, that goes to a different level of intervention, right? And one of the challenges we have now as a global community is that institutions like the World Bank have, you know, encumbered those problems, or UNDP, and so they try to force reform where they go. And of course, people then reject those reforms, and an institutional revision, and then then another country, you can guess which country I'm thinking about, goes to that same place, and they don't require any institutional reforms and any emphasis on equality and condition of women. And therefore, the people in those corrupt or inefficient institutions are able to perpetuate the problem, and they get funding from some other place that has the same lack of vision. And we can't get out of the hole, so to speak. So to me, that unfortunately is more of the problem than, and how do we reform our institutions? And to me, honestly, like, why am I a professor as opposed to working in industry? Like, I work with industry. Industry can pay me on the side for in America, you know, get 1 day a week to work with industry, right? And, you know, it can be very profitable, I have to admit, right? But, you know, why don't I just go to industry, right? Well, the reason I work with industry is because if they don't do the right thing, it's going to be really bad, right? The reason I don't go to industry is that the only hope we have is to educate students. And the more we educate students, and if they're students so my students work with students from Lesotho, and my students work with students in Morocco, and my students work with students in China, and the more that my students work with students from other countries, to me, that's the only possibility of change, is to do it to that level.
Thank you very much. Professor Romenti?
Okay, yes, thank you. I want just to come back to the reflections that we made before about gender gap on the idea of sustainability, because if I reflect upon these studies in my field of teaching, such as marketing and communication, I see some streams of research about this kind of gender gap. So, for instance, I saw some researches about the fact that most eco-friendly products are marketed to women, and most eco-friendly campaigns claims are largely aimed at female audiences. Or again, I found a paper which was published in the Journal of Consumer Research, which is a very highly impacted journal for us. It's, that says that men may be motivated to avoid or even oppose green behaviors in order to protect their gender identity. And finally, I found some studies on the use of messaging strategies, you know, for instance, about climate change and so on. And these studies showed that in order to convince people to fight against climate change and so on, we need to insist yes, men prefer arguments that are centered on science and business, obviously, while only women prefer arguments that are based on ethics and environmental justice. So, I don't have a question. It's just a reflection that I want to share with you, because as marketing and communication scholar, I'm a bit worried about that, because I found this kind of studies and this kind of streams of researches that insist on the fact that there is a gender gap. And so my question is, what we can do to promote the role of men in promoting sustainability. So I think that I'm a bit worried about that.
Well, you know, I mean, I find that research very interesting. It's not my field, so I wasn't aware of that. I asked you the question that you asked me, which is, you know, do they have a sense of why that is? Where did that gap come? I mean, does that gap come from upbringing or cultural signals?
Sorry?
Like, so how do men, what causes that gap? Does that have to do with media and television and so forth, or they don't really know how it comes to be that gap?
Most of the times they cite the fact that, or they attribute these differences to personality, you know, to the fact that women have higher levels of socialization to care about things, to care about people, so more social studies or just social psychology studies.
So, you know, I guess I would say in the United States, on some level, not because we have very divided politics, so it's hard now to talk about the United States in a way that doesn't sound wrong. But in media and in television and film, what is considered a very attractive man has really changed, right? So, you know, Paul Rudd, right, the actor-comedian Paul Rudd, somebody did a nice article on him in a magazine that was, I found very funny, but it was very accurate, because he's like a guy who would get cast as sort of a, I don't know, we have a word in English, nebbish, like a nebbishy guy, like not a very masculine kind of man, like a man that you would expect to like drop things and then because he sees a puppy and, you know, get diverted from what he's supposed to be doing because there's a puppy, right, or a kitten, right? He's that kind of man. And now, like Paul Rudd, I think it was maybe last year or the year before, got like Sexiest Man Alive cover, right? And then they interviewed him about what it's like to be, you know, Sexiest Man Alive. And, you know, he's a very good comedian, so he was very funny about, but, you know, kind of blunt about what that means, you know, culturally in the United States. And I just think that, honestly, that's a bit up to women. So, for example, there are a lot of movies today that my daughter can't watch, right? She can't watch anything in the James Bond series, right? She finds it too offensive. And as a result of her reaction to all those films, my sons now say they can't watch James Bond, right? Because they find it just uncomfortable. They're too uncomfortable. So I do think that women can guide men that they're in relationship with, whether it's a family relationship or a friendship relationship or a colleague relationship. You know, my husband has been just a great person in this regard. And one time I was at the university and there was a gentleman, I was having to have my photograph taken for some, you know how the university does a promotional magazine. So I was going to be on the cover of the promotional magazine, you know, sustainability at Rice University. They were going to put me on the cover. And so I had to get up early in the morning and have my hair done and put makeup on and a really fancy outfit because I was having this magazine cover of myself, right? And then I didn't have time to go, which I would normally do, wipe everything off my face, right? And put on a sweatshirt to go to like, my meetings at the university. And so I go to my next meeting and with this gentleman who had, I'll be generous, maybe he had unconscious bias, or maybe he didn't, right? With this gentleman, and who was a professor also, and then 4 men from a corporation. And we go into this meeting, and this gentleman, in front of these 4 men from a corporation, says that, you know, I clean up nicely and how shocking it is to have a meeting with me, to have me be so attractively dressed. And that he would like to explain to me, he was my supervisor, right? Because we had a center and he was above me in the center. That he would like to explain to me that from now on, I need to dress like that for all meetings with him. And he said that in front of these other men. And I didn't really, I mean, even as a, you know, very strongly personality woman, I didn't know how to address that because you're standing there with 5 men. What do you say? So I laughed and I said, you know, the reason Professor so-and-so was saying that is because usually, like, you know, it's like hectic in the morning and I, you know, I look like the cat dragged me in and I, you know, I hope everybody is, you know, whatever and not embarrassed by the fact that, you know, I had to get dressed up today, right? And I just made light of it. And I was telling the story to my husband. And my husband said, no, that's not what you should have said. He said, you have to understand how I feel when I'm in a situation like that. That man that's doing that kind of thing is embarrassing me, and I feel embarrassed. He says, and you need to leverage that. He said, and what you should have said is, Chris, you're making John and Paul very uncomfortable with your remarks, and I think you need to change your tone. And that if I had just said that, how he's making the other men uncomfortable, then the other men would have piled in behind me. Right? And I didn't give them the opportunity, right? I just assumed, like, my unconscious bias, I lumped them all in together, and my husband was saying, no, like, we're not all on that board, and you should just have called them out, right? And I do think that my daughter would be more apt to do what my husband recommended, right? And it really is, we really, you know, my generation believe that if we acted like men in a meeting and in our professional settings, then we would get to, you know, higher positions, and that would be meaningful for women younger than us. And that was the choice that a lot of us made, right? And, you know, successfully so. I mean, I was just recounting to Simonetta. When I first started out, I was a journalist writing about the oil industry, very successful journalist. I would go to a meeting of the international meeting of the oil industry, you know, like you guys had Gastech here in Milan last year. And the only other women at the meeting would be prostitutes, right? Like I would be the only woman there that was a professional woman, right? But you know, over time, I became, in the United States, one of the most prominent women in the energy industry, period, right? And so I guess you know, I would have said, well, my approach worked because look what happened, right? But now that I have worked with women from the younger generation, and they are so much more capable than we were, I am inspired by the fact that they just say, well, we don't care, we're just going to say, no, this is unacceptable, right? And I'm just going to say how it is, right? And I do think that the times allow that, and I think that that is going to be more successful going forward, because it's unacceptable to me that my daughter and her friends are literally experiencing the same thing I experienced. So it's true, I could guide them as to how to get to a high level in the field they want to be in, because I did that. But I don't want them to do that, right? We made the mistake because we didn't force things to change, right? So now we have to take a different position, and we have to force change.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Professor Zavarrone.
Thank you. And I change the perspective because my perspective is on the measurement aspect of the gender gap, and so gender gap and the sustainability are strictly related. But a number, 132 years, is the estimated time, ceteris paribus, to close the gender gap according to results from the Global Economic Forum. In this ranking, USA is 27, and Italy only is 63. However, this indicator is the result of an aggregation process of different domestic indicators, such as indicators of political life of women, and presence of women in board committee, and another female active in other enterprises aspects. These indicators are built with different methods and time horizons. My question is, what are the barriers, what are the limits within the countries to not develop a shared measure, an unified measure to count, to quantify the gender gap, the climate change gap, or simply a measurement on sustainability for women, or and so on? Thank you.
I mean, there are standard measurements, as you know, that people use, whether it's economic progress or health. There are certain measurements that are universally agreed to. But I think that when we only use those measurements, we're not getting to the whole problem, right? Because we have, you know, you can see in a culture like the United States where you have women leaders and women running for president and women who are running a corporation and women who are very wealthy, that, you know, it seems like it's in your power and everything is fixed. But then it's really not. And so, you know, it's really very hard because in the corporate setting, they find now, you know, in America, they make you do a little video program and you answer the questions and you have to answer the questions correctly. And when you answer the question correctly, you've taken harassment training and you're trained. Right? They've actually done studies, and they found that those trainings make people more biased, not less biased. Right? So, we really need to have more informed methodology about how to have people interact with each other in a more equal footing, and to understand what you have to do in a company to help people understand their biases. And, you know, it's training people to think differently. So for example, one example that people do, you know, we're laughing that the panel is all women, and, you know, probably throughout your university and my university, there's still too many panels that are all men. But, you know, why does that happen? I mean, that happens because people have natural social networks, and then they're thinking that they need to organize something, and so you're a man, and you're making a big conference, and you want to have somebody very important as your keynote speaker, and you think about who do you know in your network that could call someone, you know, who's working in the White House to get them to come and speak. And so you call a man that you know, who knows people working in the White House, and he gets you a good speaker, right? But because you called your roommate from college and he was the one who did it, he also gets a man because the network are all men, right? And so now we have more equality because you have more women, and the women can also call the women from their network, and so you wind up with more women. But really, it needs to be, you know, gender neutral, right? Your network should be broad, and you should, so in the story of this man that, you know, was calling people in his network, I'm in his network. And so they had a conference at, I won't say which, because I'm affiliated with multiple universities in the United States. So at one of those universities, there was a man who made a program, and he apologized at the beginning of the program that they were unable to find appropriate women speakers. And the program was featuring, I think I can say this without giving away who it was, the top US diplomat for energy. And the subject matter was such that there were 3 women scholars from that university whose specialty are one of the most famous scholars in the United States working on energy in China, a similar, very famous European scholar who works on energy in Russia, right? Myself, and then another woman who just happens to be very good on clean energy. And we were all there as participants in the room, like you're all participants in the audience. And the person holding the mantle, the panel of men, were apologizing to the audience that they hadn't been able to find women speakers, but in their own organization, there were 4 women in the audience who were specialists. I mean, recognized specialists that that person coming from the government would have called if they needed an opinion. So it's like a way of thinking. It's not that this guy has anything against us. He works with us. He knows how brilliant we are, I would say, you know, the other women at least, right? And it just was like a way of thinking about it. He just didn't think about it correctly. And so somebody had to go and say to him, you realize what you did. And I have to say, I really sincerely believe this. He was sincerely shocked, right? Because it's a habit. It's a habit. It's a habit we have to break, right? And it took the 4 of us talking to him privately on behalf of each other. I didn't care whether I was a speaker or not. I'm a speaker all the time. It was really more about having him understand how bad it looked for the university for him to do that. And to the students, how bad that looked to the students and the example it set, right? So we had to call him out. We like him, right? And he didn't do it on purpose, and he's not a sexist. I mean, it's a habit. So I feel like there has to be a safe way to help people change their habits in a way that we don't vilify them. right? I think that's the cultural problem we're having in Europe and in the United States, is how do I help someone understand their habit? They have a habit that, you know, we all have family members that have habits we don't like. And we have to think of a tactful way, because if you just go and hammer them about the habit they don't like, you don't like, then they're gonna just keep doing it, right? So you have to come up with a tactful way to assist them to, you know, think about the impact that their habit has on other people, right? So this, I think that if we think about it in that manner, and then we don't vilify the people, right? If maybe that makes it easier, but it's very challenging.
Well, thank you. So time flies. And well, we covered very stimulating topics today. And so before we finish, I would like to check if there are some questions from the audience. Yes, well, we have a couple of questions. Ladies first.
Thank you, Professor Jeff. I really think that this debate has been illuminating, and I would like to share with you a research that our university is carrying out, and I think there are many contact points. In particular, we studied the way young activists all around the world, the way they negotiate with the policy maker, and the way they communicate within their group of activists. The study was huge because we interviewed and we observed them during the Youth for Climate, the pre-COP, the COP. We delivered a survey, so different methods. And our study had not a specific focus on the gender. It was more intergenerational. But I think your talk was illuminating because we needed to move on focusing on women. And I'll tell you why. One of the findings that emerged from the study is that the attitude of young activists is changing. You know, there are still those that are very opponent, you know, really push the protest. But the majority of them has they are more open to compromise and to collaborate. And in my mind, honestly, this is associated to a women attitude. And I totally agree with what you said in response to Professor Garzoni, that the communication is important and is a skill that on which women can strongly leverage. And again, I think we have a finding that supports that. We measured the negotiation style of young activists versus the most performing one. And 83% of young activists adopt a style that is called a factual style. So it means showing a reality in a neutral form based on facts. But the most effective one is the normative style, which is about dealing with the judgment considering each other party contribution. So compromising, empathy, understanding each other perspective, again, give me the clue that women can have a big role in the future in supporting young activists in communication and negotiation. And sorry, just a little point, negotiation with the policy maker, but we also studied the way they communicate each other in their groups. And I have to say that there is no totally fairness even in their groups. There are inequalities. Yeah, even in the activity. It's a crystal clear, this fact. So minority, even among them, have, I have not digged so much the women aspect, but again, you open my mind about that, and I would love to continue this debate with all of you and Professor Rocca, because I think there are many.
It sounds like a very fruitful area for study, actually. You know, one of my responsibilities when I was at the University of California actually was to, it's a long story, but I developed this program for sustainable investing at the pension fund of the university. And so in implementing that, that made me accidentally the point person for dealing with the student activists who wanted the university to divest from something. And there were times when we had a good solution that would have really made the university innovative in its investing, impact investing or sustainable investing, and we would have a student activist that wouldn't accept that because they had something they wanted to have on Twitter that was different than that. And therefore, they lost the opportunity to get the, Regents Board, the executive board that oversees the university that's outside, the governor and people like that. They missed a window to have University of California take this really leadership position. It slowed it down because of that. And so I'm sympathetic to the idea that had they had a leader that had more ability to compromise, the university would have gotten faster to the same place we were going to go, right? And it slowed us down. It slowed us down. So I can see that from my own experience, why that would be so.
Thank you. It would be lovely to continue.
We have just time for a last question.
Good morning. I'm Alessandro Azzoni, student of Corporate Communication and Public Relations here in Ulm. I'm really glad to be here because I heard many interesting things about the role of women. And I was thinking that if we are here now, it's because there's still a problem in our society where, which is created a gap between women and men. My question is, so my reflection is that of course is important promote this role of the women because we have still a problem, but I think that it's important to create even a role of human being, because if we don't start to think that we are not different like human generation, I think that we don't resolve the problem. So in my opinion, I would like to, I think that everybody here, not just women or men, we have an important role. So the role, in my opinion, is that of human being. So mine is a reflection, and I would like to ask what do you think about it? Thank you.
So this is what I would tell you. When I have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and 2 of my children, my youngest son and his sister, were gymnasts. So you're very strong when you're a gymnast. Sometimes the older boys would pick on my son when he was little. He's actually, a very large man now, so it's kind of funny to think about, it was just the age difference. And one time, my daughter got, very protective of him. And rather than just stand in front of him or something you might have expected her to do, she took this older boy who was in middle school, who was older than her, but she was really a top gymnast. And she took him and pushed him against the wall and took his arm and, you know, placed it behind his back until he, we say in America, cried uncle. And then she said, don't you ever touch my little brother again. And that was sort of the end of the problem, right? So, you know, I mean, that's a human story. You would imagine that story happening in the opposite direction, that the brother would be doing that to protect his little sister. So I do think that it's a human capacity, right? And we're each responsible for our own behaviors. And when we talk about the gender gap and we talk about our own behaviors, right, what we're actually saying is that it was okay for my daughter. I mean, it's never okay to respond, you know, physically. It'd be better to do it with your words, but, you know, with some people, they're bully, maybe a word doesn't work. So I found it acceptable. Like, I would be willing to have the coach send my daughter home and be punished because she, you know, hurt a young man's arm, right? But, you know, is that acceptable? Like, is that acceptable? You know, one time somebody, you know, a girl punched my son during a dance because he danced with a girl, not her. And I went to the school and I said, you have to give this girl detention the way that you would give a boy detention for punching my son, right? And they were really shocked. They were not, you know, thinking that she had to be getting detention. I said, you have a rule in the school. If you punch someone, you know, at a school dance, you get detention. So this girl did it. She needs to get detention. You know, I think that the rules should apply to everyone. And therefore, all we're really saying is we would like the rules to apply to everyone. And we're not going to behave in a certain predisposed way. So if you were a boy in the gym, you know, you shouldn't just say, well, this girl should not be protecting her brother. That's not feminine. Or I would not want to take her on a date because she protected her little brother. What we're saying is, you know, the gap is that we are behaving in a way that is the way people behave in society, whether they're in a negotiation, whether they're giving instruction, whether they're on a panel, you know, whether they're allowed to speak in a group. All we're just saying is what you're saying. We're just saying it in a different way. We're just saying that we're empowering women to behave in the same way and men to behave in the same way, and hoping that all people will behave in a way that no one is a bully, right? I mean, that's really what we're aspiring to do, right, is to have this, we look at the war. We're trying to get to a place where people realize that settling things through conflict is not really the right way, right? And how are we going to get there, right? Are we going to be able to get there? And that's really the gap. It's not about, is it a girl or is it a boy? It's about, you know, was there another way to get this young man not to pick on my son, right? What could we have talked to him in a way to get him to stop doing that? And what was it that we have to do in school and in his home to convince him that that is not an appropriate way to behave? And, you know, and then on the girl's side, you know, same thing, right? So it's not really about gender, it's about having a value system for how we behave towards each other, right? And if we had that value system and it was gender blind, then we would be able to be, as you're saying, just human beings following an appropriate behavior system.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you very much. I think this is the perfect end, the perfect end. No. Yes, quickly. Oh, yeah, we have actually, because we are on streaming.
Okay. First of all, thank you, madam, for all this talk, which was enlightening. And I'm a student of strategic communication, and my question for you is this. During your profession, what was the hardest challenge you have to face as a woman in promoting sustainability in a place full of male people?
Oh man, that's such a challenge, right? So, absolutely, I take from the tone of your question, when I come in to a corporation or to a government group or whatever, and I'm a woman talking about sustainability, the inclination is to immediately discount everything I'm saying because I'm a woman. 100%. 100%, right? When I was a woman your age, and I was always, very good at what I did. I'm a person who does the work. So one thing I would tell you as a woman, always be prepared, right? So I was always prepared. And sometimes, I was very prepared, and these other people in the room were not prepared. So, but they wouldn't call on me because I was a woman. And so what I would do is I would wait until there was like a pause in the conversation so I wasn't interrupting anyone. And then I would speak without being called on. I would literally speak without being called on. And then they wouldn't cut me off because I would know that I would only do it if I was sure I was right. And part of the problem with women is you're not sure you're right, but you know you're right because you prepared, right? And so I would know I was right, and I would be prepared, and I would wait till no one was speaking for a minute, and then I would make my point. And honestly, that's how I got where I am today, because I would be in a room, and there'd be all these, I'd be a 24-year-old woman who knew more about oil than the 55-year-old men in the room who were speaking about oil, right? You imagine a subject like that's a very macho subject, and I would point out this thing that was correct, and then there would be this pause, and then it would change where we were going because, I was correct. So, but in the end, some of it in communications is some of the things I do now is I learn these methods where you can train people through the way a meeting is organized to have them feel that the idea is their own idea. Right? So, sometimes when I was a younger person, I did it by combustion. I'm just coming into the room, I'm telling you what you're supposed to think, and I'm saying it in such a forceful way, it's pretty hard to ignore what I'm saying, right? And I still do that sometimes, but I don't always do that. Sometimes I let you talk, and you tell me everything you're thinking, and then I might just ask you questions about why you're thinking that. And my questions are informed by the fact that you're not well informed, right? And then I get you to move your thinking around until you get to the point that we're discussing the thing in the way that you need to be discussing it. And in that way, I've disarmed you from your bias that I'm a woman and I don't know what I'm talking about, right? And it's unfortunate, that you have to do that, but there are different things, methods with different people you have to, in communications and in diplomacy, most importantly, your first thing is to determine with the person you're with or the group of people you're in, what is going to be the best methodology to be able to negotiate your goal, right? Sometimes it's, I did it here, sometimes it's storytelling. My kids always get angry with me because, of course, a lot of times it's a story about them, and then they're like, I went to this thing, and you told a story about me when I was 5, So, but my point to you is, it's like we call that in America reading the room. When you read the room, then, and a good course in negotiation, a lot of business schools have courses in negotiation, a good course or book on negotiation can prepare you to read the room and then decide, am I going to do it by questioning people? Am I going to do it by telling a story? Am I going to do it by bludgeoning the people because they need to be, they need to be talked down from their attitude? Like, you have to decide with your audience, who is your audience? What's your goal, right? And the most important thing I leave you with is this. If your goal is to be powerful, in other words, you want to be the boss, right? Then you inhibit yourself, right? If your goal, because really being powerful is getting the group to do what you think is best, right? So you should be able to do that and have, for example, someone else take credit. So if you were, for example, the President of the United States, and there was something you needed to accomplish, and it was going to be an easier way to accomplish that, to get the Chinese Xi Jinping to do it, and then he was going to get credit for doing that, that might be the right way to do it. Because your goal is to get something accomplished. It isn't necessarily to accomplish it where everybody knows it was you, right? So you have to, I think women are good at that, right? Of it not always having to be about them asserting themselves. It can be about setting the goal and, you know, getting what you need, right? What you want to accomplish as an activist or as a implementer, right? So just leaving you with that thought.
So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Jaffe. Yeah, it was really a pleasure. Thanks to Professor Gemmo, Professor Romenti, Dr. Romagnolo, Professor Garzone, and Professor Zavarrone for being here today. It was really a pleasure for us to host Professor Jaffe, and I hope it was a pleasure also for you to follow this debate. So thank you, and see you next time. Okay.